They made her serve drinks at the charity ball, treating her like hired help while she smiled gracefully, never revealing that her billionaire husband had founded the very event they were attending. What happened next will restore your faith in quiet dignity and poetic justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Thompson adjusted her simple black dress and smoothed her hair one last time before stepping out of the modest sedan. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel towered before her, its golden lights casting an elegant glow across the marble entrance. Tonight was the annual Hearts for Hope charity gala, an event she had been looking forward to for months. Her husband James had been unusually secretive about tonight, mentioning only that it would be meaningful for both of them. As Margaret approached the entrance, she noticed the stark contrast between her understated appearance and the opulent displays of wealth surrounding her. Women glided past in designer gowns that cost more than most people's monthly salary, their jewelry catching the light like captured starlight. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos escorted their partners with an air of importance that seemed to fill the space around them. The registration desk was managed by a stern-looking woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, Event Coordinator. Victoria's eyes swept over Margaret dismissively, taking in her simple dress and modest jewelry. There was no recognition in her gaze, no warmth in her expression. "Name, please?" Victoria asked curtly, not bothering to look up from her clipboard. "Margaret Thompson," she replied with a gentle smile, hoping to lighten the mood. Victoria's finger traced down the guest list, her frown deepening with each passing second. She flipped through several pages, checking and double-checking. Finally, she looked up with barely concealed irritation. "I don't see your name on the guest list. Are you certain you have an invitation to this event? This is a very exclusive gathering, you understand." Margaret felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. "I'm sure there must be some mistake. My husband arranged everything. Perhaps it's under his name. James Thompson?" Victoria's expression grew even more skeptical. She made a show of checking the list again, her movements deliberate and condescending. "I'm sorry, but there's no James Thompson on our guest list either. Perhaps you've confused this with another event?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Margaret could feel the curious stares of other guests who had gathered behind her in line. Their whispered conversations and raised eyebrows made her feel increasingly small and out of place. "There must be some error in the system," Margaret said quietly, maintaining her composure despite the growing humiliation. "Could you please check with someone else? Maybe there was a problem with the registration?" Victoria sighed dramatically, as if Margaret was being unreasonably difficult. "Miss, I've been organizing these events for 15 years. I know every name on this list personally. If you're not on here, then you don't belong here." A tall woman in an emerald green gown stepped forward from the line behind Margaret. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Excuse me, but what seems to be the problem here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and wasn't pleased about the delay. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria immediately straightened and adopted a more respectful tone. "Mrs. Pemberton, there's a small issue with someone who doesn't appear to be on our guest list. I'm just trying to resolve it quickly so we don't hold up the evening." Mrs. Pemberton's cold eyes assessed Margaret from head to toe, taking in every detail of her modest appearance. Her lip curled slightly in distaste. "Well, surely this can be handled more efficiently. We can't have people wandering in off the street to such an important event." Margaret felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Around her, other guests had begun to notice the commotion. She heard fragments of their whispered conversations, words like inappropriate and doesn't belong, and security should handle this. Victoria tapped her pen impatiently against her clipboard. "Perhaps you could contact your husband to clarify the situation? Though I should mention that tonight's tickets were $5,000 per person. This isn't the type of event where mistakes typically occur." The implication was clear. Margaret couldn't possibly afford to be here legitimately. The assumption cut deep, but she maintained her dignity, knowing that causing a scene would only make things worse. "I understand your position," Margaret said calmly, "but I assure you, there's been some kind of administrative error. Could I perhaps speak with the event manager, or someone else who might be able to help. Mrs. Pemberton huffed impatiently. Really, this is getting ridiculous. Can't security escort her out? We have important business to attend to tonight. Victoria nodded sympathetically to Mrs. Pemberton while shooting Margaret another dismissive look. I suppose we could make one phone call, but after that, I'm afraid you'll need to leave if we can't resolve this. As Victoria reached for the phone, a young woman in catering uniform approached the registration desk, carrying a tray of champagne glasses. Her name tag read Sarah, and she couldn't have been more than 22 years old. She had been watching the situation unfold from across the lobby. Excuse me, Sarah said hesitantly, addressing Victoria. We're short-staffed in the beverage service tonight. One of our servers called in sick at the last minute. If this lady is looking for something to do while you sort out the registration issue, maybe she could help us serve drinks. We really could use the extra hands. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. The suggestion was clearly meant to be helpful, but it felt like another layer of humiliation. The idea that she would be mistaken for hired help at an event her husband had supposedly arranged for them to attend was almost surreal. Victoria's face lit up as if she'd found the perfect solution. That's actually not a terrible idea. If you're genuinely here by mistake, then at least you could make yourself useful while we try to contact someone about your situation. It would be better than just standing around causing a disturbance. Mrs. Pemberton nodded approvingly. Much more appropriate. At least then she'd have a reason to be here. Margaret felt a moment of panic. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. She had imagined arriving arm in arm with James, being introduced to influential people, maybe even making some meaningful connections for the charitable causes she cared about. Instead, she was being offered the chance to serve drinks to people who had already decided she didn't belong among them. But as she looked around at the expectant faces surrounding her, Margaret realized she had limited options. She could either leave in defeat, potentially missing whatever James had planned for the evening, or she could accept this temporary arrangement while hoping the registration issue would be resolved. I suppose that would be all right, Margaret said quietly, just until we can figure out what happened with my registration. Sarah smiled encouragingly. Great. The uniform room is just down that hallway. Don't worry, this kind of thing happens more often than you'd think. Rich people make mistakes with their guest lists all the time. As Margaret followed Sarah toward the staff area, she heard Mrs. Pemberton comment to Victoria, well, at least she knows her place now. Some people need to learn where they really belong in the world. The uniform room was small and cluttered with extra linens, cleaning supplies, and several black server uniforms hanging on hooks along the wall. Sarah selected one that looked like it might fit Margaret and handed it to her along with a small apron and a name tag. The pay isn't great, but the tips can be decent if you smile a lot, Sarah said cheerfully. Most of these people like to feel important, so if you act impressed by their stories, they usually tip well. Just remember to stay invisible unless someone needs something. Margaret stared at the uniform in her hands. The fabric was cheap polyester, a far cry from the simple but quality dress she had chosen so carefully for tonight. The name tag was blank, waiting for her to fill in whatever name she chose to use. Is there anything else I should know? Margaret asked, trying to process the surreal turn her evening had taken. Just basic stuff, Sarah replied. Don't eat any of the food, don't sit down where guests can see you, and if anyone gets too handsy, find me or one of the other staff members. Oh, and whatever you do, don't argue with the guests. They're paying a lot of money to be here tonight, and they expect to be treated like royalty. As Margaret changed into the server uniform, she caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror mounted on the wall. The transformation was remarkable, and not in a good way. The uniform made her look like exactly what everyone now assumed she was. Hired help who had momentarily forgotten her place in the world. She pinned the blank name tag to her chest, deciding to leave it empty rather than write a false name. Somehow, that small act of rebellion made her feel slightly better about the situation. When she emerged from the uniform room, Sarah was waiting with a tray of champagne glasses and a quick tutorial on proper serving etiquette. Remember, approach from the right, offer the tray with your left hand, and always say, champagne or sparkling wine, never just drinks. These people are particular about things like that. Margaret nodded, absorbing the instructions while trying to maintain some sense of dignity. She had never imagined that she would need to know proper serving technique, but life had a way of teaching unexpected lessons. As they walked toward the main ballroom, Margaret caught sight of the event's welcome banner, Hearts for Hope Annual Gala, founded by the Thompson Foundation. Her heart skipped a beat. Thompson Foundation. That had to be connected to James somehow. Maybe his registration confusion was related to his involvement with the charity itself. The ballroom was spectacular, decorated with cascading white flowers and soft golden lighting that made everything glow with warmth and elegance. Round tables were arranged throughout the space, each covered with crisp, white linens and adorned with centerpieces that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. The guests had begun to mingle, their conversations creating a steady hum of self-importance and social positioning. Margaret recognized the type immediately, people who measured their worth by the exclusivity of their invitations and the zeros in their bank accounts. "All right, you take the east side of the room," Sarah instructed, handing Margaret the tray of champagne. "I'll cover the west side. Try to keep the glasses filled and circulate every 10 minutes or so. And remember, smile, but don't make eye contact for too long. These people like their help to be friendly but forgettable." Margaret took a deep breath and stepped into her new role. The first few interactions went smoothly enough. Guests took their champagne with barely a glance in her direction, treating her exactly as Sarah had predicted, like a functional part of the furniture. But as the evening progressed, Margaret began to notice the subtle dynamics at play in the room. These weren't just wealthy people attending a charity event. They were social climbers and status seekers, each trying to outdo the others in displays of importance and influence. She overheard conversations about stock portfolios, vacation homes in the Hamptons, and business deals worth millions of dollars. Yet for all their wealth and supposed sophistication, many of these guests displayed a startling lack of basic courtesy toward the serving staff. One elderly man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo snapped his fingers at Margaret as if she were a dog, then complained loudly when she didn't appear immediately at his side. A group of women in designer gowns laughed cruelly when one of the younger servers accidentally brushed against a guest's dress while serving canapés. Margaret found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the way the staff were being treated. These were hardworking people trying to make a living, yet they were being subjected to casual humiliation and dismissive behavior from guests who seemed to believe their wealth granted them permission to treat others as less than human. As she continued circulating through the room with her tray of champagne, Margaret began to wonder what James would think of this scene. He had always been kind to service workers, tipping generously and treating everyone with respect regardless of their job or social status. She hoped he would arrive soon and help resolve the registration confusion so she could return to being a guest rather than an unwilling participant in this display of casual cruelty. The evening was turning out to be far more educational than she had anticipated, though not at all in the way she had hoped. Instead of learning about charitable giving and community impact, she was getting a first-hand lesson in the ugly side of wealth and privilege. It was a lesson she wouldn't soon forget, and one that would shape her understanding of the world in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As Margaret continued serving champagne to the increasingly demanding guests, she couldn't help but notice how their conversations revealed their true characters. At one table, she overheard a woman bragging about how she had fired her housekeeper for asking for a day off to attend her daughter's graduation. At another, a man was boasting about evicting elderly tenants from his apartment building to convert it into luxury condos. The more Margaret listened, the more she realized that many of these wealthy individuals had lost touch with basic human compassion. They spoke about people as if they were disposable resources, obstacles to be overcome rather than fellow human beings deserving of respect and dignity. Near the center of the ballroom, Mrs. Pemberton was holding court at what appeared to be the most prestigious table. Margaret recognized several faces from newspaper society pages, people whose names appeared regularly in connection with high-profile business deals and exclusive social events. As Margaret approached their table with her tray, she heard Mrs. Pemberton speaking in her characteristic authoritative tone. "The problem with these charity events is that they attract all sorts of undesirable elements," she was saying. "Just tonight we had some random woman try to crash the party. Claimed her husband was supposed to be here, but of course, she wasn't on any guest list." The other guests at the table murmured sympathetically, shaking their heads at the audacity of people who didn't know their proper place in society. "What happened to her?" asked a younger woman wearing diamonds that could have funded a small nonprofit for a year. "Oh, we put her to work," Mrs. Pemberton replied with a satisfied smile. "She's serving drinks now. At least she's making herself useful instead of causing a scene." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she maintained her composure as she offered champagne to the table. None of them even glanced at her face, treating her as if she were completely invisible. A distinguished-looking man with silver hair leaned forward conspiratorially. "Speaking of uninvited guests, has anyone heard when the Thompson Foundation representative will be speaking tonight? I've been trying to get a meeting with their leadership for months." Margaret's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the Thompson Foundation. She slowed her movements, hoping to hear more of their conversation without being obvious about eavesdropping. "I heard they're being very selective about partnerships this year," replied a woman with an elaborate updo adorned with jeweled pins. "Apparently, they've decided to focus only on organizations that demonstrate genuine impact rather than just good intentions." Mrs. Pemberton snorted derisively. "Genuine impact? That's just code for, we don't want to work with established society. These new money philanthropists think they can come in and change how charity work has been done for generations." The conversation continued, but Margaret was forced to move on as other guests began signaling for fresh drinks. Her mind was racing with questions about the Thompson Foundation and its connection to James. Why hadn't he mentioned being involved with such a prominent charitable organization? As she made her way toward the bar to refill her tray, Margaret noticed a small commotion near the main entrance. Several staff members were rushing around, and there seemed to be some kind of preparation taking place. She caught fragments of hushed conversations about special announcements and surprise presentations. The evening's program was scheduled to begin soon, and Margaret could see guests starting to take their assigned seats. She realized with growing anxiety that she still hadn't heard from James, and the registration issue remained unresolved. Victoria had been too busy managing the event to follow up on her promised phone call. Sarah appeared at Margaret's elbow with a concerned expression. "Hey, are you doing okay? You look a little stressed." "I'm fine," Margaret replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "It's just been a very different kind of evening than I expected." "These rich people events can be pretty overwhelming," Sarah agreed sympathetically. "The way they treat people like us, you'd think we weren't even human sometimes. But try not to take it personally. They live in their own little bubble, where normal rules don't apply." As if to illustrate Sarah's point, a nearby guest snapped his fingers impatiently in their direction. "You girls, more champagne over here, and make it quick. The program's about to start." Margaret and Sarah exchanged a look before heading over to serve the demanding table. As Margaret distributed fresh glasses, she caught sight of the evening's program that had been placed at each seat. The cover featured an elegant logo for the Thompson Foundation, along with the tagline, "Transforming Communities Through Compassionate Leadership." Inside, she found a detailed agenda for the evening, including a keynote presentation titled, "The Future of Philanthropic Excellence." The speaker's name made her heart stop: James Thompson, founder and chairman, Thompson Foundation. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she processed this information. James wasn't just connected to the Thompson Foundation. He was its founder and leader. That meant he wasn't simply a guest at tonight's event. He was the reason it existed at all. The realization hit her like a physical blow. While she had been serving drinks and enduring condescending treatment from people who assumed she didn't belong, her husband was preparing to address the very same guests as the foundation's founder and chairman. She tried to make sense of the situation. Why had James allowed her to go through this humiliation? Did he know what was happening to her? Was this some kind of test or lesson he had planned? The lights in the ballroom began to dim, and a sophisticated sound system crackled to life. A professionally dressed woman approached the podium at the front of the room, and the guests gradually settled into their seats. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Hearts for Hope Charity Gala," the woman announced. "Tonight, we gather to celebrate not just the incredible work being done in our communities, but also the visionary leadership that makes such work possible." Margaret found herself frozen in place, still holding her tray of champagne as the formal program began. She wanted to find a place to hide, to process what she had learned about James and the foundation, but she was trapped in her role as a server. Before we begin our main presentation, the woman continued, I'd like to share a story that perfectly embodies the spirit of tonight's event. It's a story about recognizing dignity in every person, regardless of their circumstances or appearance. The audience settled into attentive silence, and Margaret felt an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Something about the speaker's tone suggested that this story would be more than just a generic inspirational anecdote. Earlier this evening, the woman said, a remarkable woman arrived at our registration desk. She was modestly dressed, spoke quietly, and didn't demand special treatment or make a scene when there appeared to be a problem with her invitation. Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized where this was heading. The speaker was talking about her, about the registration mix-up, and everything that had happened afterward. Rather than insist on her rightful place as an honored guest, the speaker continued, this woman graciously accepted a suggestion to help our serving staff, demonstrating the kind of humility and service that exemplifies the true spirit of charity. The audience murmured appreciatively, still not understanding the full significance of what they were hearing. Margaret felt exposed and vulnerable, as if a spotlight had suddenly been trained on her even though she remained standing in the shadows along the wall. What makes this story even more remarkable, the speaker said with a smile, is that this woman is married to the man who founded the Thompson Foundation 15 years ago. She is Margaret Thompson, wife of our keynote speaker, and she has spent this evening serving champagne to people who didn't recognize that they were in the presence of one of the most influential philanthropic families in the country. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Heads turned throughout the ballroom as guests tried to locate Margaret among the serving staff. Conversations erupted at tables as people realized they might have been rude to someone far more important and wealthy than themselves. Margaret stood frozen, her tray still in her hands, as hundreds of eyes searched for her in the dim lighting. She felt simultaneously vindicated and mortified, proud of her dignity throughout the evening, but embarrassed by the public attention. Mrs. Pemberton's face had gone ashen as she remembered her dismissive comments about putting Margaret to work and making sure she knew her place. The other guests at her table were equally horrified as they recalled their own condescending behavior. The speaker gestured toward where Margaret stood. Mrs. Thompson, would you please join us at the front of the room? The spotlight found Margaret, and she felt the weight of every gaze in the ballroom. There was no escaping now, no way to fade back into invisibility. With as much grace as she could muster, she set down her tray and walked toward the stage. The silence in the room was profound as Margaret made her way between the tables. She could see the shock and embarrassment on the faces of guests who had treated her poorly throughout the evening. Some looked genuinely ashamed, while others simply appeared stunned by the revelation. As she approached the stage, a familiar figure emerged from behind the curtain. James looked impeccable in his formal evening wear, but his eyes held a mixture of pride and apology as he watched his wife's dignified approach. Ladies and gentlemen, he said as he took the microphone, I'd like you to meet the most remarkable woman I know, my wife, Margaret Thompson. The applause that followed was enthusiastic but carried an undertone of guilt and discomfort. Many of the guests were clapping for someone they had dismissed and mistreated just hours earlier. James extended his hand to help Margaret onto the stage, and she could see the love and admiration in his eyes. Whatever his reasons for allowing the evening to unfold as it had, she knew it hadn't been from cruelty or indifference. Margaret, James said, speaking both to her and to the audience, has just provided all of us with a profound lesson about character, dignity, and the true meaning of service. While she could have demanded recognition or special treatment, she chose instead to help where help was needed. He turned to address the audience directly. How many of us can say we would have responded with such grace under similar circumstances? How many of us would have maintained our dignity while being treated as less than we are? The question hung heavy in the air, and Margaret could see uncomfortable shifts in body language throughout the ballroom. People who had been supremely confident in their social superiority just moments earlier were now confronting the possibility that they had failed a fundamental test of character. The Thompson Foundation was built on a simple principle, James continued, that every human being deserves respect, compassion, and the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to their community. Tonight, my wife has demonstrated what that principle looks like in action. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they were tears of pride rather than humiliation. She understood now that James hadn't orchestrated her experience as a cruel test, but rather as an opportunity to reveal the true character of the people they would be working with through their foundation. The guests who had treated her with kindness and respect, like Sarah and the other staff members who had shown her genuine courtesy, had passed a test they didn't even know they were taking. Those who had been dismissive and cruel had revealed their true nature just as clearly. As James concluded his remarks and the formal program continued, Margaret realized that this evening had changed her perspective in ways she was still beginning to understand. She had learned that dignity couldn't be taken away by others. It could only be surrendered by oneself. She had discovered reserves of strength and grace she didn't know she possessed. Most importantly, she had seen firsthand how wealth and status could corrupt people's basic humanity, but also how genuine character could shine through even in the most challenging circumstances. The evening that had begun as a humiliating mistake had transformed into a powerful lesson about the true meaning of worth and value. The charity gala continued around them, but Margaret knew that the real impact of the evening had already been achieved. The guests would remember this night not for the amount of money raised or the elegant decorations, but for the uncomfortable truths they had learned about themselves and their treatment of others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.